Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our section. The topic of our section is authenticating your application with the ArcGIS Platform. I'm Xueming Wu. I'm working as a product engineer on the Runtime for Android SDK. And this is my colleague, Kaushik. He's working on the Runtime for Q SDK. Before we get started, I have a few quick questions for you. Are any of you using the Runtime for Android SDK now? Cool. And for Q SDK? Good. And also iOS? Nice.
.NET. Yeah,
wow.
That's what I expect.
Okay. That's good to know. As we had quite a lot of content we want to cover today, let's get started. This is the agenda of today's section. First, we will talk about when your apps need to authenticate a user. Next, we will introduce a key component in our authentication API, which is the Authentication Manager. Then we will have two major topics we want to cover. One is how to authenticate a user to work with different authentication mechanisms. And then the role of the Authentication Manager in this process. And secondly, we will talk about how to cache the user credential to provide better user experience. First, let's take a look at when your app needs to authenticate a user. Your app, as a part of the JS community, your user may need to access the private content that hosting on ArcGIS Online or belong to an organization on a portal. Or your user may want to create or edit or publish content to their organization or the portal. And your user may also want to access premium content on the ArcGIS Online. So at that time, you need to authenticate your user. And the ArcGIS platform supports all the authentication mechanisms, including token-based, Oauth 2.0, and HTTP, and also Windows authentication such as IWA. And we also support public key infrastructure, also known as PKI. So security is a bit complicating, and to deal with this, security demands a lot of work. So we want to simplify this process for the app developers. And we want the developers to write less code to deal with different kind of authentication mechanism. We want to provide a central logic so that you only need to do it in one place and do it once. And we also want to deal with different types of authentication modes as we talk about the token-based, OAuth, PKI, etc., so that we can avoid different failure points in your app. And we want to create a common model, a common pattern in all the Runtime SDK, no matter you are working with the Runtime for SDK, Android SDK, or Runtime for Q SDK or .NET, or Runtime for iOS. So there will be the same pattern to working with the authentication API. And so to reach these goals, we abstract as much logics into a key component, which is the Authentication Manager. The Authentication Manager becomes a central place and the go-to class for you to set your handler to dealing with the authentication challenges. And it also manages the OAuth configuration to deal with OAuth 2.0 or SAML. And it also manages your client certificate to work with PKI authentication, or if your server has self-signed certificate, it also manages a list of trusting hosts. And this Authentication Manager is also managed in-memory credential cache to allow you to provide better user experience. And this Authentication Manager is a singleton, meaning that that's only one instance in your entire app. We had some documentation that you can find on our developer sites. Here's a high-level API design, the common API design for the all Runtime SDK. So at the center is the Authentication Manager. It can deal with the authentication challenge, and you also manage OAuth configuration for different authentication type, and you also manage in-memory credential cache. That's the common API design across the platform in Runtime SDKs. But there are some variation on different SDK to deal with some platform-specific pieces. We will cover a little bit of that during our presentation. With that, now I'm passed to Kaushik to do some quick demo to take a look at how the Authentication Manager can deal with different authentication type.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Shuming. So as Shuming mentioned, Authentication Manager is basically the heart and soul of authentication in runtime. It controls the entire authentication flow. So the way it works is you try to hit a secure resource. The resource raises a challenge. So the Authentication Manager looks at the challenge. It gets back some information saying, what is the challenge type? It looks at the challenge type, and then as a developer, you have to handle the challenge. Right? So we have tried to make that part easier for you. So the way we handle it is by internally providing you with some view types for all the different challenge types. And I'm going to show that to you in a minute. So once I run that application, so here, we have a very simple HTTP basic type of scenario where you just have to enter username, password. Now what you see is you get a view that just asks for username and password. Now if I switch to IWA on Windows, it wouldn't even prompt me because it knows from my login who I am, so it just goes through. But because this is Mac, it is going to prompt me. Again, once I enter my username and password, it will go through. But now I'm hitting a resource that's secured by OAuth. All of a sudden you see okay, I get a different view. This is a web view that the OAuth, the portal itself sends us once it hits that resource, right? And you can also use your enterprise login if your resource is secured via, let's say, Okta or some, however your enterprise secures your resources. You can also choose to use Facebook or Google, your social logins. So how do we get these different views? So the way that works is we handle that challenge type and we bring up these different views based on the type of challenge. So this is Dev Summit. Let's look at some code. So here is the authentication view. So in Qt, for example, it's implemented slightly differently. We provide a toolkit item, which is completely open source. You can feel free to change. So any of these views, if you don't like the look and feel, you can go ahead, change it. It's open source. So we provide a view called Authentication View. So you bring that in. And as Shuming mentioned, the Authentication Manager is a singleton. So the view has a property called Authentication Manager. And for that property, you just set as the object, the Authentication Manager of the API. So once you do that, this property for the authentication view has access to the entire authentication manager in the API. So it knows the credentials, it knows everything about it now. So How do you get that view? All you have to do is just import these two controls, which are the toolkit items. So that's how you do it in Cube. That's all you need to do. But if you want to change it yourself, there is some more work you have to do. You have to build your own view. You have to configure that. But out of the box, this is what you get. And in Java or Android, the way you handle it is there is a default authentication handler in the API itself. You create that handler and you provide your handling logic there. And that's exactly similar in iOS as well. In .NET, you have to create your own authentication view. I don't think we provide anything out of the box except for, of course, OAuth, because that's provided by the portal. So as you see, the Authentication Manager takes care of a lot of the things for you behind the scenes. So you have to write as little code as possible if you want to use the default views. We're going to show you more of each types and how they work later on. Back to you.
Thank you, Kaushik. From Kaushik's demo that you already had some feel of how the Authentication Manager can work with different security mechanisms. Now let's take a close look at how your app can authenticating a user. Say, in your app, if you want to load a secure web map, or you want to load a layer that is hosting on a secure server, and the server errors send back an error through the response. And at that time, the Authentication Manager comes into play. The Authentication Manager intercepts the error and check what caused the challenge. Is it has a user credential being providing, or is it the username password incorrect? And then the Authentication Manager also checked the authentication mechanism configured on the server or the portal. And based on the mechanism, the Authentication Manager will challenge and provide some UI based on the handler you set it on the manager. Once the user provide correct credential and this server or portal successfully authenticate the user, and then the manager will start the loading process to load the web map or the layer. So that's the process of authentication happen behind the scene. We talk a little bit about authentication challenge when in the authentication API. Whenever that you don't provide correct credential, or there's no credential providing, the Authentication Manager will issue a challenge. This challenge contains all the information relating to the challenger, like what's the cause, the exception, and if that's a credential already providing, or the URL of the host you are trying to access, and also the number of tries you have failed before. And then this authentication challenger object will be issued to the handler to handle the challenge. And also, we had API called request configuration that you use to turn on or turn off the challenge if you don't want your app to access any secure content. And the type of the challenging is we support that if username and password are required, or that is the Oauth code is needing, or that's you are trying to hit a PKI's secure endpoint that a client certificate is needing, or that's you are access a server with self-site certificate that was issued the SSL error. And the action according to this type of challenge is you need to provide username and password or provide OAuth authorization code or OAuth token, or you need to provide a client certificate, or you want to trust a host with self-signed certificate, or of course you can cancel the action and do nothing. And we had three approaches that allow you to handle these challenges. One is that the SDK will provide a default handling, as shown in Kush's demo on Qt. They have Authentication View is providing through the toolkit. That's the default handling logic they're providing by the Qt SDK. On the other SDK, like on Android and Java, we had a default challenge handler as a part of the API. That's an object. You can use this object to handle all the challenge, and you will get all the user experience out of the box. And that's the same way in iOS. .NET, it's a bit different, and Coach already touched a little bit for that. And of course, if you don't like the look and feel of the default handler, you can create your own custom handler to handle all the challenges based on your business logic. And that's a third approach is you can use a mix and match approach. That's you can extend the default handler and override some of the logic or override some of the UI. Now let's take a quick look at the default handler provided by the Android and Java SDK. This default handler, it's a class called default challenge handler, and it provides the user experience to meet its challenges. And it also pass in credential once the user pass in their credentials for username and password or token or a client certificate to the URL that you want to access. And it also allows you to trust and trusting hosts. And that's underneath the diagram shows a few UIs according to different authentication mechanism on the server. It could be a token base on the far left, or it's an IWA, or the second from the left, and the third one is to allow you to input a client certificate. And sorry, the second one is allow you to trust and untrust hosts. And the third and the fourth is the input the client certificate. And the rightmost is the UI to allow you to work with OAuth. And to use this default handler, it's pretty simple. You only need to input 2 lines of code in your application. First, you create an object from the default authentication challenge handler, and then set this handler on the Authentication Manager to tell the Authentication Manager, I'm going to use this handler to handle all the authentication challenge. That's all you need to do. And now, let's take a close look at how to work with the OAuth using the default handler. I think you guys already heard of, actually you guys already work with OAuth. So when you use your social account like your Twitter account or Facebook account to access to work with the third-party application, that's the OAuth play in behind the scene. So it is actually a standard to authenticate before among the web-enabled devices and the servers. There are 2 patterns to work with OAuth. One is using user login. And when using user login, your app will direct to a page that prompts user for that ArcGIS Online username and password. And the user then use that credential to access the content. So the user login is allow ArcGIS Online user to authorize your application on their behalf. And that's the link to some documents talking about how to work with user login on a mobile platform. And the second authentication pattern is app login. App login is these apps need to log into the platform for the user, and your app access the content using a hardcode credential that belong to the app. So the user may access the content that they don't belong to, but through the app. So the Oauth login, it's a two-step process. First, your app redirects to the login page and prompt user for their username and password. Then the ArcGIS Online will authorize the user and create authorization code. Then ArcGIS Online will exchange the code for tokens, including the access token and refresh token. When using the default challenge handler to work with Oauth, the Authentication Manager will go through this two-step process. And to use the default handler, you only need the workflow is to create Oauth configuration using your client ID and the redirect URI. Then add this Oauth configuration to the Authentication Manager. Then the Authentication Manager will go through the two-step process to obtain access token and refresh token for the user. And the access, besides go through this two-step authentication process, the Authentication Manager also refresh the access token, because the access token is a short-lived token. It's 30 minutes. It will be expired after 30 minutes. So the Authentication Manager will, when it expired, the Authentication Manager will use the refresh token to regenerate access token and use the new access token to continue in the login status. And default handler also supports social login, as Coach already mentioned in the Q demo. With that, I'm passed to Coach to do another demo to work with Oauth on Qt.
Okay. In the last demo, we saw how we handled the different types of credentials. In this one, we're going to delve a little bit more into the OAuth type. So once I hit a resource that is secured via OAuth, very likely you're going to encounter a page like this where you have to either use your username password, or in some case, if it's secured by the app, then the app can just log in. In this case, I'm using the user type. So I'm just going to use my username and password. And once I sign in, it lets me through. So the good thing about OAuth is the developer has no knowledge of what you're transmitting through the wire, because that web view page was sent by the portal. So you enter your credentials and we have no knowledge. I mean, at that point, it's between the end user and the portal. It just goes straight to that. The developer has no knowledge of what was sent through that pipeline. So as Shuming mentioned, the OAuth, now it has generated a token. This token is short-lived. It is 30 minutes for the token to be active. But you can choose, we provide in our API to refresh that access token. So that's called a refresh token. But let's first quickly take a look at the code to see how all of that worked. So what happened was, in order to create a login via OAuth, you need to create an object called OAuth client info. And again, this is standard for all the APIs in Runtime. So how you create an OAuth client info object is by providing the OAuth mode. So in this case, as I mentioned, I am providing the user mode, but there is another mode, which is the app mode. And for the user mode, you need to provide something called a client ID. Now, how do you get the client ID? You have to register your app, go to ArcGIS Online, create an account, register your app. Once you register your app, it generates a client ID. So you get that client ID, put it back in your app. And now that app knows that, okay, I need to access this resource via OAuth. So, and once you have that client info object, you create a credential object. So then in the credential object, there is a property called OAuth client info. You set that client info object to the one that you just created above. And then you create a new portal. I created a new portal right here. And then you set the portal's credential property to the credential object that I just created above. And after that, you just call load on the portal to sign the portal in. And once it has logged in, so I'm just checking here if the portal has successfully loaded. What you see here is I'm creating a new portal item, which is one of the items, the map that you saw with yellow dots. I get the item ID, I create the portal item, and I create a new map out of it. And then I just set the map on the map view. So it's pretty simple once you understand the whole mechanism of how it works. With that, I'm going to pass it back to you, and then we're going to explain how you can cache and like how you can reuse some of these stuff later on.
Thank you, Kaushik. You already see some demos of using the default handling on Qt and also saw the UI from the image on Android. So, but there's sometimes you don't like the look and feel of the default handling, and you may have a different workflow or different logic you want to support in your app. So at that time, you may want to use your custom handler. And to allow the Authentication Manager to work with the custom handler, it's a bit platform specific on different SDKs. And like for Q, their default handling is through the toolkit using the Authentication View. And then to customize it, you can just override some of the UI or some of the logic in the from the toolkit. And on Android and Java, it's a bit different. We had an interface called Authentication Challenger Handler. So to write your own custom handler, you implement this interface and override a method called handle challenge and set this handler on the Authentication Manager. Of course, you also need to implement your own UI to like prompt user for credentials. And next, I'm going to show you a demo on Android to see how to write a custom handler and how to. Let's take a look at that. Let me switch it to the. Sorry about that. Let me quickly switch. So let's first look at a demo here. Okay, let's look at the code first. So this is an Android application in Kotlin. So to create your custom handler, first you need to implement this interface, Authentication Challenger Handler. And then after you implement it, you set this handler on the Authentication Manager. And when you implement this interface, that's the method you need to override. This is the handle challenge. This is the method you must override to create your own custom handling. And in this logic, because this is apps to dealing with IWA authentication. So first, I will check the challenge type if it's a user credential challenge. Then I will check if the user has failed to pass in correct username password in previous trials. And because I set the maximum, in this app, I set the maximum attempts to be 5. So I check if the user has failed before. Like the challenge will know the numbers of trial before. So if it still doesn't exceed the maximum attempts, I will continue to prompt the UI for username and password. If it exceeds the max of 10, I will just show out notes and then cancel the action. Then here's the call the action to cancel it. And then next, if the user pass in correct username and password, I will create a new action to continue with the credential that providing by the user. Let me show the demo. Here's the demo. I pre-launched the demo to the emulator. So here's a portal. This is a IWA secure portal. So I want to access this portal and find some web map that it's already authored on in this portal. So I hit search, then it's the app prompt with username and password. The UI is a bit different from the default handler, which the default one use dark thin and I use white thin here. And then once you input username and password, and I then start the authentication process. Once I successfully sign in, and a list of the web map hosting on the portal will be shown, and then I can load any of these web map. So the Authentication Manager will know that I use the custom handler and go through the process of the providing by the custom handler. So that's how you deal with how to work with the custom handler.
As you can see, there's quite a bit of code involved with the custom handler. So it's easier to write out of the box, use out of the box solutions, but then you might have your own needs. So.
Next, let's take a look how to cache your user credential. The Authentication Manager, after you successfully sign into a portal or ArcGIS Online, the Authentication Manager will cache the information and then reuse it later. The goal for that is that we want to allow the application to provide better user experience to minimize the unnecessary prompts or the duplicate prompts for the user. So the Authentication Manager manages in-memory credential cache, and this credential cache is enabled by default, and it's global. So that means you can the app can reuse by any object in the same security domain, and this credential cache is also allowed you to persist the user credential between user sections or between your applications, because the user may quit from the application and relaunch the application. And by persist the credential, when user sign into your application again, when the user relaunch the application again, they don't need to sign into the portal or online again when you're using the persist credential. Or you can persist credential to use the user credential among different devices. So to persist the user credential, thus the workflow is also pretty straightforward. First, you can persist credential cache to JSON string. However, this JSON string will be in clear text, and you can reload the JSON string into the credential cache. So as the credential cache, the JSON string is in clear text, we recommend that the developer to encrypt the JSON string when they want to persist into a file and locate and store the file on their devices. So pre-bit noting that it's your responsibility to encrypt the credential cache if you store that in a file and store it on a device. Here's the two line of code snippet to persist the credential cache using the Android or Java SDK. So you just call credential cache to JSON, and it create a JSON string for that. And then if you want to reload the JSON string into your credential cache, you only need to call credential cache restore from JSON. That's all you need to do to persist your credential cache and use it between user sections on applications. And you also can remove the credential from your credential cache. You only need to call credential cache clear, then all the cache credential in your cache will be clear. And we recommending you when you sign out from a portal or your user exits from your application, you should call this credential cache clear to clear the user credential from your cache. With that, I'm passing to Kushi to demo how to work with credential cache and persist your credential cache in Qt.
So let's run that same application that I had before, and let me show you something really simple at first. So let me sign in to a resource with just a username password. So I provided my username password and my items loaded. It's just a map image layer. Now what will happen if I try to remove the layer, completely destroy it from memory, and try to add it again? Should it prompt me for credentials? It should not in this case, because we as an API, we cache the credentials and we already know who you are, so we just make use of that credential and we pass it down to the resource again, and we just load the same object. But now if I say I want to remove the layer and I clear the cache as well, now I have cleared the cache. As a developer, I have chose to clear the cache. Now if I try to load the same resource again, I get prompted. So the resource has no knowledge of who I am. So you can do similar things in OAuth. So as we had seen before, once I provide my username and password, I am logged in. And as I had mentioned before, remember the access token expires at 30 minutes. So let's say it has been 30 minutes and my access token is expired. So there is something called refresh token, and I can take the refresh token and refresh my access token. So in this case, I'm just going to do that, although it's just going to work anyways because it's not been 30 minutes. But to see it in code, this is what you do to remove the credentials, like what I did in the last section where I removed all the credential cache. So you just say the Authentication Manager is just a singleton. You can access it anytime, Credential Cache, and remove all credentials. To use the refresh token, so when I logged into the portal, I took the credential object and I saved some little tiny things and as globals in my app. This is a very simple app, so you can choose to persist them on disk, or you can choose to save them in memory, however, whatever your app demands. So in this case, I just saved something in memory. So what I did is, there is something called Oauth Refresh token. So I saved that refresh token so that I can reuse it later. So when I'm creating a new Oauth credential object, and remember I had created a client info object before, so I cached that entire client info object and I'm reusing it here. That way I don't have to recreate all of the client info properties. And same with the refresh token, and same with the token service URL, because there is a URL that we go and hit with that token to regenerate the access token. So those are the three things you need to cache. So you create the credential object just using those cached objects, and then it's the same way. You're creating a portal again, just pass in the credential object that you just created using all those cached properties and objects, and it loads you in. So the other thing is, what happens if you have a need to close your app and then don't need to re-log in again? So I can choose to save my refresh token on this. So if I click on save refresh token, I close my app. Let's look at the code real quick, what I did there. So here is my save refresh token code. So I just create a JSON string, and what I did is I stored my portal URL, I stored my refresh token, I stored my token URL, and a couple of things from the client info objects, the client ID and the OAuth mode. So I just created a JSON, and all I did is I wrote a JSON file with all of this information. So what I'm going to do is now I'm going to rerun the app, and I'm going to load from using that refresh token that I just persisted. So if I say load from refresh token, it did not prompt me for any username or password. But let me show you that code to you, how I did that. So this is how I loaded back from that JSON. So again, I created a JSON file by reading, a JSON object, reading from the JSON file that I had just saved before, because I know where I saved the file, I know the file name. And then I read back the client info properties from that JSON file. I read back the client ID and the OAuth mode. And then I create a credential object. I set the credential object's OAuth client info to this client info object that I just created. And also I read the token service URL, because I need to know the token service URL that I need to hit to regenerate that token. And of course the refresh token. Once I did all of that, and then I created a portal, and I know the portal's URL because I had cached that as well. So I use the JSON's portal URL, the portal URL from the JSON I had just saved, and I use the credential object that I just created above right here. And then I said login required is true. And after that, it's all about, if you just ignore that code, it's all about just portal.load. And it knows, it gets all the credential and loads it for you. So you don't have to worry about it, the user having to re-log in. But if I go back to my app and I say remove my refresh token, or actually let me close it. So I've removed the refresh token. Now if I go back to OAuth and I said try to load from this refresh token, nothing's going to happen because my refresh token's gone. So I have to regenerate it. So some platforms, in fact iOS The refresh token is valid for 90 days. So for 90 days, you can choose to the user not having to log in. But in, like for example, in Qt, we don't have the ability to refresh the refresh token. iOS, what you can do is you can store it in keychain, and you have the operating system also provides some capability to regenerate that refresh token, so that user never will need to log in. I think in Android and Java, you probably have, it expires after 90 days. You don't have the capability, right?
Yes, we also support that because that's a new, it's a new feature that is enforced by the whole ArcGIS platform, because we want your apps to be more secure. So the 90 days is the maximum expiration time for the refresh token, but it kind of still depends on your business logic. You can set your portal or organization to allow the refresh token to expire early on. 90 days is the maximal limit. It
all depends on your needs. If it's in a high secure environment, I would say, you probably have to clear the cache, and they do not cache anything. Every time you log in, you probably require the user to log in, because let's say somebody logged into, you are logged into a resource and you walked away somewhere. It's been more than 30 minutes. You come in, you refresh the token, and now no username password is needed. Somebody else comes who's not supposed to read those get access to those resources. They will be able to access those resources.
Does the Authentication Manager provide a mechanism to invalidate the refresh token and or the access token?
We are adding this feature in our upcoming release.
In 10.7 or?
Yeah, because it's supported by 10.7, so we are adding this in upcoming release, maybe
of runtime.
In runtime, maybe in a few weeks.
Couple of weeks.
Yeah,
we're going to release 100.5,
and then we will support this new feature they're adding in 10.7.
Yeah. So once you can choose to completely once you delete your refresh token, you invalidate it. You sign out, you invalidate the refresh token completely. So yeah, do that. Couple more weeks and you can do that. So yeah, as you can see, we provide a lot of these flexibility in our API for you to use. We hope you find it useful. And again, our recommendation is use OAuth as much as possible, because it's the most secure way to sign in. And if you look outside, every time you're logged into Google, all your access. You're accessing different apps of Google, you're always using OAuth. Same thing in Facebook. So OAuth is highly recommended. Of course, your organization might have their own limitations. You're almost, you have time. So I want to quickly touch on offline content security. So what happens is a lot of times, in runtime, you're downloading content on your device. So we encourage you to secure those items, either delete them as quickly as possible. If that's not something you can do, we highly encourage you to encrypt those items. But of course, you will need to decrypt them when you send, when runtime accesses them, because we do not have a mechanism to encrypt or decrypt those items. But we are adding some functionality pretty soon where items can have a timeout. So after a certain time, that item will expire. So if there is live data in those items, those data will expire. So we are adding some features. But iOS, I know, for example, you can have some built encryption. The operating system allows you to build encryption into those items. So, but not, especially for cross-platform APIs, that's really difficult. But I don't know of any other platform that provides that. I know iOS is the only one that kind of currently provides that. That's it? No?
So in today's talk, we talk about when your apps needs to authenticate a user and how the Authentication Manager will become the key component to help you to work with the authentication API to authenticate your user, and the process of the authenticating a user with different authentication mechanisms such as OAuth, PKI, IWA, and token base. And we also cover how you can cache your user credential is either through the Credential Cache, which is managed by the Authentication Manager in memory, or you can persist a single credential to JSON and reuse it later. And this cache the user credential is we want to provide a better user experience for users. Don't prompt them like every time you want to access the same resource from the same security domain. With that, that's all we have for today. So we had a few minutes to take questions.
Just a little more on the maximum refresh token. Is it still necessary to request -1 to get the maximum?
Right now, even you request -1 to that, in 10.7, there won't be like an endless refresh valid refresh token anymore. The maximum is 19 days.
Okay, and that maximum 90 days can be overridden by the ArcGIS Online organization. Is that an upcoming ArcGIS Online enhancement, or is that a current setting? Couldn't find it there.
I know that is coming in 10.7. And then you can override it with 10.7 portal and organization. You can configure that to be less than 19 days.
But not in ArcGIS Online?
I'm not sure about that. I can take you to ask ArcGIS Online about their timeline to support this new feature. Sure. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Can you query the expiration on the token so you can find out how far away you are from it expiring?
The question was, can you query the expiration token and you find out?
JSON or something?
This is a little bit platform specific. In some API, like in iOS SDK, they expose the API this property allows you to know that when your token will be expired. But as far as I know, Android and Java haven't exposed this property yet. So you may have to check the API that you are using to see if this property has exposed. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much for attending our section.